at the Royal Mathematics Forum, where suits are as crisp as the minds of their wearers, and every footstep echoes with academic titles and degrees, a woman walked in quietly, without a name tag, without a business card, without a spotlight to welcome her. Evelyn Grayson, with her simple low bun, a faded grey sweater, and worn-out soft-soled shoes, looked like a speck of dust, misplaced in a room gleaming with prestige. Hundreds of eyes turned, not because she stood out, but because her presence felt jarringly out of place. A Princeton student leaned over and whispered, as if sharing a mildly amusing secret. "Is she one of the staff?" A professor from Yale curled his lip, slightly glanced down at her frayed shoes, then turned away with a mixture of confusion and condescension. Evelyn said nothing. She walked to the last row where no one wanted to sit, opened a weathered leather notebook, and sat upright, as if that corner were a stage meant only for her. No one in that room knew she was the only daughter of a mathematician, once shunned by the academic world for his unorthodox ideas, a man who spent years hand-copying formulas from library books while his daughter slept on an old chair nearby. And even fewer knew that the man silently watching every reaction in the hall was not some stranger or curious attendee, but her husband, Daniel Marlowe, tech billionaire, keynote speaker at Davos, a man who had once spoken to tens of thousands yet chose silence as his wife stepped into a room where every gaze seemed eager to cast her out. But Evelyn didn't need anyone to walk beside her, because this time she hadn't come to be welcomed. She came to remind the world that sometimes the person most worth listening to is the one you never wanted to see. The remarks were spoken just softly enough to seem accidental, yet each word was sharp as a razor slicing through the air and landing straight into the skin of someone who never meant to harm anyone. Maybe a janitor wandered into the wrong room. A Harvard student smirked, not bothering to lower his voice, as if Evelyn's presence was a public joke. Another snorted, glancing at her faded cardigan, then told his companion, "That sweater's probably older than my dissertation." A young professor from Stanford, her makeup flawless and heels clicking in proud rhythm, leaned slightly and said, "Judging by the look, she's probably a single mom, searching for inspiration in the wrong place." They didn't notice how tightly Evelyn's hands gripped her worn leather notebook, her knuckles turning white. No one saw the faint initials, e.g. faded by time, etched into the cover by her late father, the man who once wrote theorems in blue ink, when his daughter still only knew fairy tales. To Evelyn, that notebook wasn't just a memory. It was a silent reminder that she hadn't come into this room to be accepted, but to remind those too busy ridiculing others that true knowledge doesn't reside in tailored coats or academic titles, but in hands that have endured silence, borne the weight of disregard, and still held onto their worth. And just as her father once told her, on a night without electricity, as they studied math beneath a candle's flicker, timely silence is stronger than any voice. Evelyn didn't need to react. She only needed to wait for the right moment. And when that moment arrived, not a single one of them would dare to speak again. Some geniuses are raised in laboratories, nourished by prestige academic titles and research funding. But Evelyn Grayson was not one of them. Her brilliance was forged in the scent of frying oil, the clinking of spoons against porcelain bowls, and endless night shifts at a diner where no one ever asked her name. When her daughter Elara fell asleep on the booth bench, Evelyn scribbled unfinished equations on the backs of discarded receipts. She once solved number theory problems using a pencil borrowed from the cashier. On nights when the lights went out, she copied proofs from memory, illuminated only by the glow of a flickering open 24H sign through the glass window. She had been kicked out of a public library for wearing a faded hoodie and having grease stains on her sleeves mistaken for a homeless woman. They didn't know she had finished 3 textbooks on group theory in just 2 months simply because she wasn't allowed to borrow them. They also didn't know that this woman was the rightful heir to the Grayson Corporation, a long-standing financial empire. But Evelyn had turned it all down the office on the 62nd floor, the 9-figure investment account, and the honorary vice chairwoman title she never needed. "I don't sign contracts I haven't fully read," she once told the family lawyer. "And I don't carry the Grayson name if it means bowing to things I don't believe in." Evelyn had no PhD, no recommendation letters from Cambridge or Caltech, but she had something no university could teach: courage forged in solitude, intuition sharpened by days of hunger that never starved her thirst for knowledge, and something burning quietly in her chest, not for fame, but for understanding. She didn't have a prestigious degree, but she had fire, and that fire today had quietly stepped into a room where everyone believed they were the only ones carrying the light. When Professor Harrington, the man famously dubbed Mr. Infallible, once featured on the cover of Nature, beside a complex blackboard diagram, stood up to present, the entire hall held its breath. He began to draw elegant symbols, each line of his equations unfolding like a symphony of geometry, precise, sharp, and unquestioned. No one dared to interrupt. But in the last row, a woman with a worn notebook stopped writing. Evelyn tilted her head, eyes narrowing, fixating on the 3rd line of his slide, where a familiar assumption of continuity was presented as though it were beyond dispute. Then she raised her hand. Whispers and stifled laughter rippled through the room, not because of the question itself, but because the hand in the air belonged to the woman in the outdated cardigan. "Excuse me," Evelyn said, her voice soft but clear. "In line 3 continuity is assumed for surface P, but the boundary conditions of this function space don't permit that, unless a Dirichlet condition is also assumed, which I don't see included in your presentation." The room froze for a second. Then, almost as a collective reflex to dismiss discomfort, a wave of laughter erupted. A student nodded mockingly, whispering to a friend she probably Googled that last night. A professor from Yale chuckled dryly, trying to prove intelligence by nitpicking mathematical typos. And on stage, Professor Harrington raised an eyebrow, gave a curt nod, and continued without responding, as if he'd been momentarily annoyed by an insect. But only he and Evelyn knew she was right. Only the two of them understood that if this paper were published with such a logical flaw, an entire research framework would have to be rewritten from scratch. Only he and the woman without a degree understood that in a world filled with polite applause and silence born from fear of confrontation, the one who dares to speak the truth is the one least afraid of being dismissed. And from that moment on, Evelyn was no longer that woman. She was a threat. She was a shard of broken glass in a crystal banquet. And every gaze, once mocking, began to sharpen with caution. Evelyn didn't ask for permission. She simply stood up. The room seemed to sway slightly as the woman they had just mocked, the one they had deemed an outsider, began walking toward the board as if it had always belonged to her. No microphone, no pre-written slides, no tech assistant waiting beside a laptop. Just a box of white chalk and a cold green board in front of nearly 200 minds shaped by the world's most elite institutions. She picked up the chalk, and she wrote. No voices, only the soft sound, like falling leaves of chalk, sliding across the board. Yet each symbol she inscribed felt like it was carving through the very prejudice of the room. Evelyn didn't simply correct the flaw in Professor Harrington's argument. She dissected it, laid bare its faulty assumptions, and within just 3 brief lines introduced a new transformation never before published one that condensed three traditional derivations into a single, unnervingly concise equation. Everything froze. A lecturer from MIT gently set his coffee down, his eyes fixed on the board. A student from École Polytechnique inhaled sharply, and Harrington himself, a man who had never been interrupted, mid-conference, walked slowly toward the board, stared at the fourth line Evelyn had written, then stepped back, as if pushed by the force of an irrefutable truth. Evelyn turned around. Her hands were covered in chalk dust. A few beads of sweat clung to her cheek. But her eyes, those eyes no longer belonged to someone once kicked out of a library for wearing a grease-stained hoodie. They were the eyes of someone who had just rewritten a chapter of mathematical history and had done so in the very room that tried to dismiss her the moment she walked in. No one in that room said a word, because they all knew what had just occurred wasn't a correction. It was a declaration. And with every symbol still quivering on the board, the old world had just begun to fall. Then came a sound, not of laughter, not of mockery, but the screech of a chair pushed back forcefully by someone who could no longer sit still. Dr. Evelyn Chen, from MIT, one of the most globally recognized young female mathematicians, sprang to her feet, eyes blazing, as if she had just witnessed a shooting star in broad daylight. "That's the Takahashi transformation," she nearly shouted, pointing at the formula Evelyn had just written. That transformation. It was only introduced last month at the Superstructure Geometry Conference in Tokyo. Only 5 people attended that session. I was one of them. The room erupted in a wave of murmurs and shocked chatter. Names, papers, and references swirled through everyone's minds. Phones came out. Articles were searched. And then a ripple of disbelief surged through the crowd. The Takahashi transformation was real, but Evelyn had written it out effortlessly, without a moment of hesitation, without any reference material, without any external aid. She had simply stood there. Chen turned to Evelyn, her voice full of confusion. "How did you know? It hasn't been published widely. It's not taught anywhere outside Japan." Evelyn met her gaze neither boastful nor apologetic. She gave an answer that brought the entire hall to a stunned hush. "I didn't read it. I just saw it in my head. When he wrote the third line, I saw the gap and filled it." Another silence followed, but this time it wasn't out of disdain. It was awe. It was disbelief. It was the inescapable weight of truth. Harrington, the man who had stood behind hundreds of podiums, revered as a living pillar of algebraic geometry, found himself speechless. His hand clenched the laser pointer so tightly that it clicked under pressure. His eyes met Evelyn's, and in that instant, he knew he had been surpassed, not by a seasoned colleague, but by a woman who just minutes ago had been the subject of the room's ridicule. Evelyn didn't need a title. She didn't need an introduction. She didn't need medals or academic nominations, because today she had done what no one in that room had dared to dream. Proven that genius does not need an invitation to walk through the door, and once it does, it will make the entire world nod in recognition. Evelyn didn't stop there. While the hall was still reeling from the revelation of the Takahashi transformation, she returned to the board, wiped away the previous chalk lines, and began writing again. This time, the solution to the topological folding problem, long deemed indeterminate for over a decade. No textbooks, no pauses to think her chalk, moved like an unstoppable current. A problem once labeled unbreakable was now unraveling layer by layer, assumption by assumption, stripping away decades of rigid limitations. Then came the second problem, a proof in entropy logic theory that had forced a research group in Zurich to postpone their publication. Evelyn wrote the first line. 3 minutes later, every blind spot was gone. The third was personal a rebuttal once used to expel her father, Professor Marcus Grayson, from the Global Geometry Council for being too impractical. Evelyn made no announcement. She simply wrote. And when she set the chalk down, everyone in the room understood. Marcus's honor had been restored by the hands of his own daughter. No more whispers, no more mocking tones. The people who had once ridiculed Evelyn were now bowing their heads, not out of shame, but because there were no words left to say. A lecturer from Oxford whispered, "Write it down fast. Don't miss a single line." A Harvard student trembled as he copied each symbol as if afraid the miracle would vanish before he could grasp it. Evelyn stepped down from the board. There was no applause. No one dared disturb the sacred atmosphere drawn in chalk dust. She walked slowly past those who had once belittled her, who had said she didn't belong here. Her gaze was not defiant, not cold. It was the calm stillness of someone who had seen the truth, proven it, and no longer needed anyone's validation. Because Evelyn understood, true justice doesn't need cheers. It lives in the lowered eyes. In the trembling hands, I copied it down. And in the silence, heavy and reverent, a room that once believed only they had the right to speak. Today, they had learned one thing. People may laugh at you until the moment you make them bow. The room remained frozen, as if no one dared be the first to shatter the moment, until a warm, deep voice echoed from backstage. A small side door opened, and stepping in was none other than Daniel Marlowe, founder of Marlowe Systems, the young tech billionaire once featured on the cover of Forbes, known for keeping a low profile at scientific events. But today, he was present. The crowd stirred. Cameras flashed. A few reporters stood up, but Daniel looked at no one. He walked straight to the stage to Evelyn, the woman he had watched from a private screen for the past 2 hours, and took the microphone. He spoke briefly without flourish, but every word cut deep into the pride of those who had laughed at her. "I'm Daniel Marlowe, and the woman you mocked, she is my wife." The packed auditorium suddenly felt void of air. He paused for a moment, then continued. "Starting today, we are founding the Grayson Foundation, named after her late father, a genius buried by prejudice. The foundation will offer scholarships and research grants to individuals who've been dismissed by society, mocked for not fitting the ideal mold. Just like Evelyn, the woman you spent the last 2 hours ridiculing." Gasps, avoided gazes, faces that once held smug expressions, now flushed with shame. Evelyn said nothing. She simply stood there, her hand gently holding that of her young daughter, who had fallen asleep in her arms, unaware that her mother had just rewritten history. She didn't need applause. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need an apology, because the silence in that room was the recognition. She smiled not with smugness, but with something far deeper, the quiet, knowing that the world had finally looked up. Not because she screamed for a place, but because her worth left them no choice but to see her. Evelyn Grayson Marlowe, the woman who once scribbled formulas on diner receipts, now had the entire academic world bowing its head and was writing a new chapter, not in chalk, but in unshakable belief, in kindness, intellect, and justice. And in that moment, the story ceased to be about mathematics. It became a story about justice. When the stage lights dimmed, social media lit up. But this time, it wasn't the usual glow celebrating prestigious professors or lofty keynote speeches. It was short video clips from the conference livestream, capturing every sneer, every contemptuous glance, every cutting remark hurled at Evelyn Grayson. One 7-second clip went viral. "That cardigan must be from Queen Victoria's time, huh?" The speaker's face was unmistakable, a Rhodes Scholar hailed as the future of anthropological statistics. 2 days later, he received notice that his scholarship had been revoked for violating the ethical standards of the academic community. A brief apology was sent to Evelyn's inbox. No one ever saw her reply. An elderly professor from Cambridge who had chuckled when Evelyn corrected Harrington was suspended. His latest research, once nominated for the Fields Medal, was withdrawn after it was revealed he had unknowingly used a method Evelyn introduced at the forum without credit or permission. Even the event's host, the one who had cut Evelyn's introduction from the official broadcast, appeared on live television with a sheepish expression opening with "I owe both the public and Ms. Grayson a formal apology." But Evelyn never appeared on screen. She didn't respond to emails. She didn't issue a press statement because she didn't need revenge. She didn't need to scream that she had been right. She simply continued to live, continued to do mathematics, continued teaching her daughter how to live with dignity, not to be accepted, but so she would never have to bow to anyone. And that silence was the most resounding response of all, because those who once laughed at her were now being laughed at by the entire world. And Evelyn, she didn't laugh. She didn't cry. She stood taller than them all, simply because she never bowed the way they once did. 2 years after the day that forced the academic world to redefine the meaning of worthiness, the largest lecture hall at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, was packed. They hadn't come out of curiosity. They came out of respect. The speaker wasn't a professor with hundreds of scientific publications, nor a media-glorified international math champion. The speaker that day was Evelyn Grayson Marlowe, the woman who had once been mocked for her worn-out shoes, once dismissed for lacking prestigious degrees. She stood there, simple, humble, yet commanding, like a monument, not because of a title, but because of the living story she carried with her. In the front row, her daughter sat attentively, eyes fixed on her mother. In her hands was a pristine notebook, its leather spine embossed with 3 letters, EGM, Evelyn Grayson Marlowe. Not merely a name passed down, but a reminder to live worthy of all her mother endured to clear the way. Evelyn didn't end her lecture with a complex formula or a dazzling slide. She simply looked into the eyes of her students and spoke gently, yet the words rang through the hall like a declaration: genius doesn't wear robes. Genius might be standing behind a cash register, holding a mop, or sitting in the last row silent. But when they rise, the world holds its breath. The hall remained silent. No one clapped, not because they didn't want to, but because the moment was too sacred to be broken by noise. They didn't just see a mathematician. They saw a living testament to resilience. A legacy written not in fame, but in defiance. A promise to the next generation. You don't need to be born into privilege. You just have to rise, and the world will no longer dare to look down on you. And if somewhere out there, a girl is hunched over a restaurant receipt, scribbling down a formula, she is not alone. Because Evelyn stood, and now that path will remain open forever. I remember back then, I just glanced at her and laughed. Not loudly, just that small, condescending kind of laugh from someone used to reading who belongs in a room like this and who doesn't. She clearly didn't. No name tag. No one welcomed her. Not a single handshake or nod from anyone in the field like they gave to me. And that sweater, it looked like it came from a thrift store in suburban Boston. I thought, probably some single mom who wandered into the conference. Or worse, someone from the organizing staff checking chairs. She sat quietly, but the way she looked at everything as if she were evaluating all of us made me uneasy. Who gave her that right? And when she raised her hand during Harrington's talk, I couldn't hold it in. That's when the insults began, and I swear I wasn't the only one who said it out loud. When I walked into the auditorium, the name tag reading Professor Charles Whitmore, Oxford instantly caused a few students to shift aside and make way. In a place like this, people look at name tags before they look you in the eye. Every glance knows how to measure others by titles and accolades. So when I saw her sitting quietly in the last row, wearing a faded sweater, legs crossed, holding a worn leather notebook, I silently concluded, probably event staff or someone waiting to clean up after the forum ends. But then, those eyes. I remember pausing for half a second. She was staring straight at the stage, unshaken, unblinking. There was nothing about her that seemed out of place or insecure. No fidgeting, no twisting of hands, no scanning the room for a familiar face. And that gaze, it felt like she was turning the lens back on the entire room, weighing every person, every talk, every formula. It sent a chill down me for just a moment, but I brushed it off immediately. I leaned toward the person next to me and chuckled. She looks like a single mom here to pick up her kid from tutoring. Has no idea this is the Royal Mathematics Forum. A few smirks followed, and I, self-assured, believed I was still in control of the game. What I didn't know was that very gaze on that very afternoon would rewrite everything I had ever believed about what it means to be elite. I'm the head of a research group at Stanford, and like everyone in academia, I have a habit of looking up anyone who catches my attention. After that day, I went home, opened my laptop, and searched her name across every platform: Google Scholar, Archive, ProQuest, ResearchGate. No PhD, no thesis, no university, no trace at all. At first I assumed she was one of those self-proclaimed geniuses like the countless people who've knocked on my office door with half-baked theories, but something wouldn't let me move on. She was too composed. The way she corrected Harrington's presentation, it didn't feel like luck. It was strategic, experienced, deep. Then I remembered 6 years ago, there was a storm of discussion on an anonymous math forum, a post that reanalyzed Yale's so-called impossible model and solved it with a never-before-published transformation. The academic community debated it for 2 years, unable to verify the author's identity. The author had signed it simply E.G. That night, I reopened the post, and my heart pounded when I saw the final line was written in the exact same handwriting as her notebook. In that moment, I realized something. The woman we had dismissed, the one we assumed had just wandered into the wrong room, had never studied anywhere at all, because she herself was the place where knowledge had been forged by real life. I was the last person to leave the auditorium that day. While packing up backstage, I noticed an old leather notebook left behind on a chair. No name, no logo, just worn corners and the yellowed stains of time. I hadn't planned to open it, but in a moment of passing curiosity, I flipped through the first few pages. They weren't academic notes like we usually take, but a messy interweaving of mathematical formulas and ordinary life. The first page: grocery list, 3.14 apple, 2 PR2, out of pie at home. I chuckled. A woman writing poetry from circles, using the formula for the area of a pie to remind herself the fridge had no more dessert. But the deeper I went, the heavier my heart grew. Scrawled lines hastily written on old receipts, paper towels, even the back of a newspaper. Reprove Euler's theorem while daughter sleeps. Don't cry after job rejection, prove you're right first. Day 17. No one believes the solution yet, but I do. I stopped at one page. It held only a single line written in red ink. If Dad was still alive, I think he'd be proud. I closed the notebook unable to read another word. In that moment, I knew I had been wrong about her. And I was wrong not just for underestimating a brilliant mind, but because the entire world of people like us, those in suits with titles standing at podiums, had forgotten something essential. True genius doesn't just live on paper. It lives in how you keep believing in what's right, even when the world leaves you behind. As I traced the fragments of her past, I found myself at a small public library in suburban Boston, a place filled with nothing but old books and the weary glow of yellow lights. I asked an elderly librarian if she remembered anyone by the name of Evelyn Grayson. She looked up, paused for a moment, then gave a sad, knowing smile. The girl who strapped her baby to her back, did math in silence for hours. How could I ever forget? The librarian told me Evelyn wasn't allowed to borrow books. Back then, she didn't have a valid library card. She could only read on site, and since she couldn't afford photocopies, she hand-wrote entire chapters of the most complex academic texts into an old notebook. Once the librarian saw Evelyn rocking her baby to sleep with one hand while writing differential equations on the back of a grocery store receipt with the other. Sometimes, when her daughter cried, Evelyn would soothe her by drawing circles and explaining they were mommy's moons before turning back to unfinished derivations. She didn't look like a student, the librarian said, didn't look like anyone I'd ever seen. But that look in her eyes, it belonged to someone who never gave up. I left the library that day with my throat tight. She didn't have a research office, she didn't have scholarships, she didn't have time, but she had something many professors had long forgotten: the reason we began learning in the first place. Evelyn didn't abandon her dream. She simply tucked it into the corners of hand-copied pages so that one day, that very dream would become the doorway her daughter would walk through. I couldn't stop thinking about the name Evelyn Grayson and the strange coincidence with the Grayson Institute, once a sanctuary for modern mathematics. The place where her father, Professor Henry Grayson, had once been a towering figure, was later forgotten by academia for his too radical views. I decided to dig into old personnel records, the kind of archives no one ever bothers to check. Among hundreds of entries listing engineers, PhDs, department heads, one name stood out in the service staff section: Evelyn Grayson, night shift janitor. I thought I must have misread it. Evelyn, the woman who had just silenced an academic council with an original equation, had once held a mop at the very institute where her father used to lecture. I called a former staff member who used to work with her. He spoke slowly. As he recalled, she showed up on time every night, didn't talk much, but there was something odd. When she cleaned the research rooms, she'd always stop to read the equations on the board. One time, I saw her holding a cloth, but not wiping anything. She stood there staring at the board for 10 minutes, like she was having a silent conversation with it. I asked, "Did no one notice?" He replied, "Who would pay attention to a janitor reading quantum math? Everyone was too busy being scholars." That answer left me speechless. She, the daughter of a buried genius, once bowed her head to scrub the cold floors of the very place her father once stood to teach. Not because she had given up on her dream, but because she didn't need to sit in the front row to be worthy of the blackboard. She just needed to see it each night, to nurture what the world had tried to extinguish in her: the belief that intelligence has no rank and genius requires no reserved seat. As I dug deeper, I uncovered something nearly unbelievable in the archives of the Grayson Foundation, a fund established after her father's death to honor his contributions to mathematics. That year, there was a freshman applicant who had impressed the entire selection committee. The application was exceptional. The essay felt as if it were written by someone who had tasted the bitter chill of failure, and still chose to rise. The name on the file, Evelyn G., a scholarship worth nearly $200,000 was awarded. But less than 24 hours later, the office received a reply, brief but sharp as a blade. "I'm grateful for your kindness, but I cannot accept this scholarship. I want to reach the finish line under my own name, not the one others once disgraced." Evelyn Grayson. At the time, no one fully understood the weight behind those words, but I did. That was when she began choosing the harder road, not because she lacked opportunities, but because she refused to walk in the shadow of a painful past. Her father had once been fired by the very Grayson Institute after criticizing bias within the academic council. His name had been removed from lecture halls, scrubbed from teaching materials. And now, she, his daughter, refused the honor that bore the name Grayson, just to prove, if she ever stood at a podium one day, it would not be because she was someone's daughter, but because she had earned that right herself. That wasn't arrogance, it was unwavering loyalty to a legacy the world had once rejected. I thought I had uncovered every surprising truth about Evelyn Grayson until the name Daniel Marlowe surfaced in a quiet backstage conversation among senior advisors. One of them leaned in and whispered, "Did anyone notice Marlowe sat through the entire session?" Said nothing. But his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a CEO. They were the eyes of a man holding his breath out of pride. Daniel Marlowe, CEO of Marlowe Quantum, one of the pioneering giants in quantum tech, a Time magazine cover figure, often hailed as the mind of the next 3 decades. I managed to arrange a private interview with him tucked away from the noise of the event. No assistants, no cameras, just a wooden table and one question I couldn't keep inside. "Were you surprised to see Evelyn being honored that day?" Daniel looked up at me. He didn't smile, he didn't deflect. He answered with a single sentence, soft like something he had carried in silence for over a decade. "I waited for that moment, for 11 years, but I never dared to help her. Not because I couldn't, but because Evelyn never needed saving. She just needed to be seen." I was speechless. She, the quiet woman with the worn sweater and steel gaze, had once been married to one of the most powerful men on earth, and never once used that as a shield. Throughout 11 years of marriage, she had never stepped on stage with him, never appeared in a media profile, never posed for a single public photo. Not because she was hidden, but because she chose never to lean on someone else's spotlight, even if that someone was the towering force behind modern technology. She knew her worth wasn't in a business card or in the hand holding hers in public. It was in every equation, every failure, every night spent wiping whiteboards, every scribbled line in a battered notebook. She didn't need to be lifted up. She only needed a world quiet enough to hear her when she walked in. I used to believe that geniuses like Evelyn Grayson were rare flames flickering up from the cracks of a broken world. That is until I met Ilara. The event that day was a math symposium for gifted high school students. I had come to observe a few projects from promising young minds. But then, at the very end of the row, where the light barely reached, I saw a young girl sitting quietly hunched over, writing intently in a gray leather notebook. It wasn't a sketchbook, it wasn't a diary, it was filled with equations. And the formulas, it took me a few seconds just to keep up with the way her mind was leaping between each line of thought. I bent down and asked gently, "Where do you go to school?" The girl looked up. Her eyes were wide, calm, and her voice was steady, like she was repeating something sacred. "My mom says, don't study to be seen. Study to see what others can't." I froze, not just because of what she said, but because of the name on the small badge pinned to her chest, Elara Grayson Marlowe. She didn't say anything else. She simply closed the notebook quietly. I caught a glimpse inside, the same kind of handwritten notes, the same script I remembered from the notebook her mother once brought into the hall of the Royal Mathematics Forum. No one taught Elara how to show off, but clearly she had inherited both the brilliance and the grace of the woman who was once laughed at in public, yet ended up making the entire world bow. No one handed Elara a throne, but perhaps she's growing up to build an empire not with money, but with knowledge and humility. Evelyn Grayson left her daughter no noisy inheritance. She left her a legacy written in chalk, in tears, and in the unwavering belief that kindness and justice can be passed down. While researching Evelyn Grayson, I accidentally came across an old manuscript, a research paper rejected more than 7 years ago by one of the most prestigious mathematical journals in the world. The author's name was listed as E. Smith, a name too ordinary to draw attention. But the clarity of thought, the framing of the problem, and especially the proposed solution, were anything but ordinary. I cross-referenced every symbol, every line, and stopped at the final section where she introduced a conversion model in non-conventional space, something that only recently a research group in Europe has begun to publish. The reason for rejection was stated coldly, unclear whether the author possesses sufficient academic credentials to further develop this hypothesis. Suggestion: consider collaborating with a team of established experts. In other words, the paper wasn't wrong. The writer just didn't carry the proper identity to be believed. The pseudonym E. Smith, I verified it. It was Evelyn. She had used her mother's maiden name, deliberately hiding the Grayson surname that the academic world once regarded with suspicion. I don't know what she felt when she received that rejection letter. Maybe disappointment, maybe pain. But the one thing I know for sure is she didn't stop. She kept writing, kept doing math while her child slept, kept taking her whiteboard to the park, kept choosing to live in quiet persistence so that one day, without needing a name or a title, she could step onto the biggest stage and leave the entire world in silence. I printed out that paper, framed it, hung it right above my desk, not because its content was revolutionary, but because it is the symbol of a dream that never needed permission to keep being written. I used to believe that in a world of great minds, the ones who spoke louder, wrote more, appeared more often, would win. I used to think silence was a sign of weakness, of someone too powerless to fight back. And then I met Evelyn Grayson. Over the course of 2 years following her journey, I never once saw her argue with anyone. Not a single post of criticism on social media, no complaints submitted to academic boards, not one word of rebuttal toward those who deemed her unworthy. She didn't write status updates. She wrote equations. No lengthy presentations, just a few lines of formulas on a board. And she let the room figure out the rest. She's the kind of person who makes you realize not everyone needs to shout to be heard. Some people, when they walk into a room, the entire world goes silent, not because they demand it, but because you recognize you've just witnessed something beyond your ability to respond. When Evelyn stood at the podium, chalk dust still on her hands, and the very people who once mocked her sat in bowed silence, I understood power doesn't lie in your voice, it lies in the results that no one can deny. She never needed to clap back, because her journey was the answer. And from that moment on, the one who had written hundreds of sharp, articulate commentaries, who believed everything needed to be said to matter, was for the first time silent. Not because I had nothing to say, but because Evelyn Grayson had said everything through her silence. At the Global AI Summit in Geneva, where camera flashes never stop, and every footstep on the red carpet is captured by a dozen media lenses, a middle-aged woman walked slowly toward the main hall. No evening gown, no badge, just a faded wool coat, snow-damp canvas shoes, and a wrinkled leather bag that looked like it had weathered dozens of winters. A security guard stepped forward, his gaze scanning quickly, as if long practiced in separating those who belong from those who don't. His voice was cold, laced with a hint of condescension. "This event is for registered guests only. Ma'am, I'll have to ask you to leave the hallway." The woman didn't flinch. No protest, no anger. She simply reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn name card, its edges frayed, the print faded by time. Dr. I. Renault, founder of Renova Logics. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The bustling welcome hall fell abruptly silent. The guard's eyes widened. The receptionist clutched the guest list, her face paling. A reporter adjusting his microphone looked up stunned, his expression frozen in disbelief. They had just expelled from the venue the very woman who built the core technology, and the entire summit was gathered to celebrate. But she, Isabelle Renault, only bowed slightly and smiled. Not a sad smile, not a bitter one, just the kind of smile worn by someone long accustomed to being misjudged, but never letting that stop her, because she hadn't come to be welcomed. She came to remind the world that the people who build the future don't always enter through the front door. Isolde Renault didn't enter the tech world through a prestigious gateway. She slipped through the cracks of a system built only for those with surnames and degrees. After the sudden death of her husband, she and her 3 young children moved into an abandoned storage unit behind a print factory. No heating, no insulated walls, only the clatter of an old keyboard and the sound of lullabies whispered through cold nights. She made a living by fixing discarded computers. There were nights when one hand stitched torn backpacks for her kids while the other typed lines of code under the dim glow of a phone charger lamp. No research institute invited her to collaborate. No company offered her funding. But she didn't need them. Because she didn't code to prove she was good, she coded the way others pray, with fear, with faith, with whatever was left of hope. Her first laptop came from a landfill, but the first lines of code, written on it, were the seed of the technology the world now reveres. And no one knew that every line was typed with a child in one arm, while the other hand wrote out a dream no one else was brave enough to believe in. In 2016, a major tech corporation hosted a developer community showcase where Isolde, hoping simply to be acknowledged, presented the first demo of her AI system capable of analyzing emotional nuance through vocal expression. She signed no NDA, had no lawyer, just dark circles under sleepless eyes and a trembling voice as she shared what she had built. 3 months later, the company launched a new product. The interface was different, the name rebranded, but the core algorithm was identical down to the smallest quirks only the original author would recognize. When she emailed asking for an explanation, they never responded. When she sought legal help, the lawyers scoffed. No degree, no documentation, no case. Online, a few voices spoke in her defense, but the majority dismissed her as delusional, a desperate mother looking for attention and a payout. But Isolde didn't fight back. She didn't call the press. She didn't retaliate. She simply wiped the old OS, reopened her code editor, and began again from scratch. The new version was no longer just a linguistic analysis tool. It learned emotion, context, and even silence. It didn't just read words, it read the human heart. And this time, she encoded it in her own way, with a double helix structure that obeyed no known system, rendering it impossible for anyone to steal again. No one knew who had added Isolde Renault's name, to the list of keynote speakers at this year's Global AI Summit. Maybe it was an anonymous student she once helped on an open-source forum. Maybe it was a young engineer who used her codebase to write their thesis. Or maybe it was the illiterate child in the video she was about to play with. When her name was announced, there were murmurs of confusion. A few brows furrowed, trying to recall where they had seen this woman before. But when she stepped onto the stage, silver hair neatly tied back, the same old coat with the folded cuffs, every whisper vanished. No PowerPoint, no sponsor logos, just an old USB stick plugged into the projector. The screen lit up an 8-year-old boy, sitting alone in an empty room, his eyes blind to light. He was reading a book through a warm, gentle voice coming from the device beside him. When he hesitated over a difficult word, the AI softly explained, "This word means hope." It's like the feeling you get when you believe tomorrow might be better than today. The entire auditorium held its breath. Isolde said only one sentence. No flourish, no jargon. "I didn't build AI to make a profit. I built it for the child who had no one to read with." No one laughed. No one spoke. Because for the first time in their lives, technology made them want to stand and applaud. Not for its brilliance, but for its kindness. The moment the video ended, before a single clap could break the stillness, a man in an expensive suit shot up from his seat in the middle of the auditorium. It was Marcus Delroy, Chief Technology Officer of Helix AI, one of the world's leading AI firms. The same man who once boldly declared, "No self-learning system is truly decentralized unless it comes from us." His voice rang out urgent, shaken, laced with disbelief. "This is the self-learning model we haven't been able to decode." That was you. Every head in the room turned toward the stage. Isolde didn't meet his eyes. She simply bowed her head slightly and inserted a second USB stick. The screen shifted to a simple interface, an open-source system, clean, elegant, transparent. In every line of code, the tag IIR v2 appeared consistently, quietly, like a declaration that didn't need to shout. No one said a word. No one needed to. All the glossy introductions, academic titles, Forbes, 30 under 30 features, none of it could overshadow the truth, now projected before them. The breakthrough system. Dozens of researchers had tried to reverse engineer for the past 3 years, had been written in silence during late nights, in a storage unit where 3 children were asleep. The first to bow was Marcus, then someone from Deep Synth Labs, then a critic who had once dismissed her in the press, then the entire auditorium falling silent together as if they had all just stepped out of a long illusion and for the first time seen a truth so raw yet so breathtakingly human it left them speechless. A young journalist determined to dig deeper into the woman who had just silenced the entire tech world traced the path of her eldest son, Jean-Luc Renault, now a data scientist at the prestigious Karolinska Institute, one of Europe's leading biomedical research centers. They met at a small cafe in Stockholm. Jean-Luc didn't speak right away. Instead, he quietly pulled an old piece of paper from his jacket pocket, its faded blue ink showing a line of linear equations in neat, round handwriting. But in the lower corner, there was a drawing of a small house and 3 smiling children. He said, "I was 7 when my mother's demo was rejected by a major tech board for the first time. I remember her standing at the sink for a long while. She didn't cry, didn't yell, didn't blame anyone. Then she returned to the table and taught my younger siblings how to draw a parabola using colored markers. My mother never fought back with words. She healed by continuing. She taught us math, not so we could be brilliant, but so we would understand that knowledge is something no one can ever take from you, no matter how many times they erase her name. Jean-Luc looked up. His eyes held no bitterness, no pride, just a quiet, steady gratitude. They used to laugh, but my mother never needed to beat them. She only needed to make sure we never learned how to give up. Right after the summit ended, the atmosphere in the Grand Hall shifted entirely. Those who had once whispered behind her back, those who had raised eyebrows at the mere mention of the name Isolde Renault, were now quietly asking for business cards, trying every possible way to approach her. A vice president of strategy at Helix AI, the same company that had once discreetly leveraged her foundational AI code, came forward with an offer. We're prepared to invest a 9-figure sum to acquire Renova. Isolde simply shook her head. Renova wasn't born to be sold. It was born to stay with the people whose dreams no one ever tried to buy. Amid the flood of emails and open letters, one name stood out: Professor Edmund Harsley, the man who had published a scathing critique 7 years ago, tearing apart her early work, calling it immature, unfounded, and deeply concerning. He requested a private meeting. They met in a small room behind the stage, no recorders, no media. Just one man whose reputation had once helped block the path of others, and one woman who had kept walking through the darkness. The professor's hands trembled. "I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Isolde looked up. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried more weight than 1,000 academic words. "I don't need an apology. I need you to never do that to anyone else again." He lowered his head. No rebuttal, no excuses, just silence. She walked away without looking back. Because those who truly stand tall don't need to step on others, they just need to make sure they're never stepped on again. On the day Isolde Renault was awarded the Medal of Scientific Freedom at the Pantheon, where legends like Marie Curie and Pasteur had once been honored, she brought no entourage, gave no long-winded speech. The only thing she requested from the organizers was this: in the row of honored guests, leave one chair empty and place a small sign on it for the unheard genius. The ceremony was grand, with over 300 delegates from across the world, but it was that one empty chair that silenced the entire hall. No one sat in it, but everyone looked toward it as if they had once seen themselves there. The student was marked down for thinking differently from the textbook, the graduate whose thesis was rejected for being too ambitious, the mother, the father, the shift worker who quietly closed a notebook during break because maybe their dream didn't fit reality. Isolde stepped onto the stage, silver hair, unkempt, slender fingers, clutching a pendant, shaped like a microchip, the symbol of Renova. She didn't thank the government. She didn't speak about herself. She looked toward the empty chair and said, "I didn't come here alone. I came on behalf of everyone who was told to sit in the back row, denied scholarships, or advised to be more realistic. If I am seen today, then tomorrow it's your turn." And as thunderous applause filled the room, the empty chair remained still. But it was no longer invisible. You may have never stood on a stage, never received a medal, and perhaps no one has ever called your name in a crowded hall. But if you've ever had to start over from nothing, ever carried a dream too big for a life too small, then you'll understand why the story of Isolde Renault is not just a journey. It's a wake-up call. In a world where recognition often outweighs integrity, where front row seats are reserved for degrees and the back row is left for the uninvited, there are still people like Isolde, like Evelyn. They weren't celebrated. They didn't have golden resumes, but they possessed something far greater: unshakable perseverance and a belief that never died, faith that understanding, kindness, and creativity don't come with pedigree. Isolde coded in the dark. With an old computer, she didn't create just an application. She rewrote the definition of human-centered technology. Evelyn didn't argue to win, she quietly stood up, corrected every error, then stepped down when the world could do nothing but bow. They didn't chant slogans. They didn't demand justice with tears. They created justice, simply by existing in a way that could not be ignored. And if you've ever been passed over because you weren't impressive enough, ever stayed silent in a meeting because you thought you weren't the one meant to speak, ever folded up a dream on paper because no one believed in it, then remember, you are not alone. You are not wrong. You are simply walking a path paved by those like Evelyn and Isolde, a path not lined with roses, but at the end, it is you who will plant the garden. Don't let this world decide who you are just because it hasn't seen you shine yet. Show them that when you rise, they won't be able to look away. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Toch Story, where every video isn't just a tale, but a message that real worth doesn't come from applause. It comes from the gaze of a child who got a chance because someone once believed, even when no one else did. Because sometimes the ones who were once asked to leave the hallway are the ones who end up redefining the path for everyone who walks in after.